Well, hello and welcome to week 10, chapter 10. This week is all about economic development and change. So we explore terms like developed and developing. We talk about the Brant, B-R-A-N-D-T line. And just as a point of warning, there will be a lot of maps in this lesson, but that's okay. Don't let that trouble you. What I hope you get out of the maps isn't necessarily a memorization of the map, but the fact that the map hopefully shows you in pretty clear graphical form development or lack of development. So I just want you to see patterns and trends. So that's what I want you to focus on. All right, so beginning, when you look at something like this, the idea of power plants, whether they be fossil fuel ones or solar or wind or geothermal, this really harkens and implies development. It implies a moving economy. It implies all those kinds of things, right? So let's define it. Defining development, the extent to which human and natural resources of an area have been brought to full productive use. And it's culturally relevant because it basically depends on where you are. Sometimes basic wood and other such biomass resources are considered really, really significant. Whereas if you live in the United States, wood, other than to build a house, it's often maybe something that you would use in a fireplace or a barbecue. Get it? So it's a culturally relevant and culturally variable definition. There are intra-state distinctions and interstate. So intra meaning within and inter meaning between. These are what development suggests: modernized world, low fertility, women in the workforce in great numbers, more so than men, urbanization, and a level of sophistication, which some might think of it as a wrong way of looking at it. It seems snooty. Maybe that's not the right word, but you know what I mean: snobby, snooty. But there is a level of sophistication if you want to think of it in terms of technology, definitely. But again, that's culturally relevant, and it's really depending on the point of view of an individual or a region. So it's a very complicated subject, clearly. It's more complicated than it would seem off the top. So the idea of development and underdevelopment, is it static, culturally relative? I would say no to the first one and yes to the second. What counts as advanced? What are some of the other terms you might hear? First world, third world. I know you've heard that. And then there's the Brant report on the global north and the global south. And this is used a lot. This is used in the climate change argument and discussion. People, when they say the global north, they're talking about us. They're talking about Europe. They're talking about Japan. They're talking about Australia. And when they talk about the global south, they talk about anybody else who is not considered very developed. That's just the way that is. Again, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it's incorrectly used or correctly used, again, it's a very culturally and individually relative thing. For some, development also suggests changes in social, cultural, and political structures, freer, better voting, less corruption. Again, you could argue for and against any of these, but while there's plenty of corruption in the U.S., let's not kid ourselves. It's less corrupt because there's many things that are in place to help prevent some of it. It doesn't prevent all of it, clearly. But there's a definite change in levels of corruption, for example, in the United States over the past 200 years compared to where you find, say, areas of sub-Saharan Africa today. In some of those countries where the very, 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 very few elite basically absolutely rule over the mass of poverty. and they take advantage. So it's a much more stark haves versus have-nots. Okay, to many people, the idea of development and underdevelopment are really post-World War II inventions of Western culture, but it is what it is. That's how it began to be defined, and essentially that's how the world is measured now. And again, you can talk about ideas of inequity, ideas of lack of development, and we'll talk and touch on some of those as the lesson progresses. And finally, the Brant line, I'm going to show you what that looks like. And there it is. Anything north of it is developed. Notice how China and India are not included. So China, India, especially, are kind of caught in the middle. I mean, China is this big behemoth with obviously a very strong economy, yet China has a significant area that's really not really well developed. So China sort of straddles both sides. Anything in the blue here is considered the least developed. And there's a significant portion of that in Africa. Remember, Africa is a region of the world that is still significantly growing in terms of population, and also an area of the world that is becoming the manufacturing hub of China. So the joke has always been, if you look at a piece of clothing and you look at the tag, it would say made in China. In the future, that will be made in Africa somewhere. And that may not affect you, but it probably will affect your kids and your grandkids as Africa becomes more and more of a manufacturing hub for the world. And that's going to be a good thing for them, frankly. It means in the future that their fertility rates are going to drop, and it means in the future that their income is going to increase. Is it going to be quick enough? Probably not. Again, under development, it suggests the desirability to improve your material well-being. And again, special cases, as I mentioned, Brazil, India, and China. So here's an example of a city like Sao Paulo in Brazil. Notice, this is a favela. This is the actual city, so stark contrast. Again, Manaus in Brazil. This is in the middle of Amazonia. This is in the middle of the Amazon basin. This is as far as you can get without being in a completely untouched by human hands kind of place. Of course, you know, in South Africa, so South Africa is very sort of bimodal, meaning there's lots of wealth, but lots of poverty. Again, third world countries occasionally applied to developing countries as a group. It used to be a very politicized term. People really get away from this. You don't hear this term used very much. You simply hear developed and developing, or more developed and less developed. There are a few places that are the least developed places, and they include Somalia, North Korea, Afghanistan, and Yemen. These are the 4 least developed places in the planet. And here's an example. This is the Korean Peninsula from space. These are the lights you see. Is if you were basically at night, you could see all the highways and the city. Notice the difference between South Korea and North Korea, and then China. North Korea is basically dark at night. This is, you know, again, what happened. Basically, I need to update this. As of 2020, this hasn't happened yet. The Korean War has never ended. It was simply basically a stalemate, an armistice that was signed. But basically that effectively closed off north from south. And you have this sort of demilitarized zone, which is basically a big giant border crossing that's sealed. So that's one of the sort of leftover post-war geopolitics of this region. That's kind of what it looks like. You think the wall we're proposing between the U.S. and Mexico is big? This is impenetrable, unless it's a James Bond movie. And that's what it looks like. So that is the actual border. On the far end, you see North Korean soldiers. And here you have an American and a South Korean soldier, and they basically stare at each other all day long. They are basically authorized to kill. This is the one border, the one area that North and South Korea have agreed to meet. There's a room, half the table is in North Korea, the other half is in South Korea, and that's how they conduct business all these years later. Fascinating, fascinating place. We'll talk about some of this right here. The idea of the core periphery argument when sharp contrast exists within spatial systems in terms of economic development. Everything really sort of harbors to this sort of like downtown suburb. That's what core periphery basically means. The core meaning where most of the energies are happening, most of the manufacturing, and then the periphery is sort of the outskirts. Okay, wealthy, the core is considered to be wealthy, prospering, high tech, the growth and prosperity of core regions at the expense of the peripheral regions. Okay? And then the periphery is depressed, underdeveloped, and dependent. So many would argue that many in the US, we would call ourselves the core, and then a lot of the places that have supported our development would be the periphery. What China is doing in Africa is another example of core. Suddenly China is the core and Africa becomes the periphery. Now you can argue what's going to happen in Africa in terms of manufacturing is going to be a good thing for them because it would help them to get jobs and it will help them to increase their income. But you can still argue it is a core periphery sort of discussion. Talk about some of these. The Sustainable Development Goals. These were originally adopted in 2000 and updated in 2015. 17 goals, and here they are. So these sustainable goals have all kinds of, from no poverty all the way to peace, justice, and strong institutions, life and climate action, industry, affordable and clean energy, all the things here in the news, basically, gender equality, education, clean water, and sanitation, a lot of things that we in the US, frankly, take for granted. I know you do because I do, we all do. You take your water access for granted. You just turn on your tap and there it is. You flip a switch and you expect electricity. You plug in your computer and you charge it and you expect that Wi-Fi to not only work, but to work at 100 to 300 megabits per second. Don't deny it. You expect that kind of technology and access to it. And that's fine. That's fine. We all do. I'm not singling you out or myself out. It's just a thing. However, in many parts of the world, that's just simply not the case. So it's this whole have-nots, core periphery kind of argument. We'll talk about these issues, diffusion of technology, and we're going to talk about one of the economic measurements of development would be gross domestic product. It's the total market value of all final goods and services provided by a country. So it's basically the income of a country, basically, all that a country is worth. So for example, in 2014, 2015, and now 2020, that's the US GDP, and that's T for trillions of dollars. China, notice how they will eventually overtake the US sometime in the 2020s. Canada, for example, and Mexico. And the source for this is the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so now Gross national income is not only the total value of goods and services, but income received from other countries. So here's an example of GNI per capita. Notice how the Brant line is shown in every single one of these images to help you to see. Notice how everything south of that line is in the lighter color, less. Anything north of it is in that darker color or more. Percentage of the workforce engaged in agriculture. So again, let's just look at a map. Again, notice the more developed you are, the less you are engaged in agriculture. The less developed you are, the more. So anything south of that line is in the darker green. First, prevalence of undernourishment. So this is not necessarily malnutrition, but undernutrition. Malnutrition means you eat junk. Undernutrition means you just don't eat enough of what you need. So prevalence of undernourishment, notice again, south of that line, what numbers do you find? Well, you find basically data that is 20 to up to 60% undernourishment. Notice north of that line, it is less than 5% everywhere, with a very, very few exceptions. Okay, the idea of inevitable development, you know, the post-industrial US, Western Europe, Japan, and basically the three up-and-coming China, India, and Brazil. We'll talk about the idea of non-economic measurement of development. Drinking water is, again, and sanitation. You turn on the tap and you expect water to come out. You go to the bathroom and you flush and you expect it to, you don't even think about it. It just simply goes somewhere, right? The sewer system. And so that is a very significant measurement that's non-economic of development. We talk about education as another measurement. So we're talking about water, education, and health. And of course, technology. So those are the four. Again, let's go over them again. Safe drinking water, education, health, and technology. So let's look at some maps. Okay, so here is a map of illiteracy among those 15 years or older. Again, look at the Brant line, that purple line. Look south of it. You're talking about values in these range. Look at north of it. You're talking about less than 10%. Everywhere north of that line. Can you sort of see the pattern? Again, I don't want you to remember an individual country. You do not need to know that this is Mali and that's Afghanistan. I just simply want you to see the pattern. Here is internet access. Now, this is becoming more widespread, but you still definitely see the fact that north of that, we're talking about 80 to 100% almost internet access. Access to basic water or drinking supply, a drinking supply that is healthy. And in the dark blue is 95 to 100%. And notice wherever you see the green, so anything less than 70% or less than 50%, it is almost exclusively in the African continent. And then associated with water, you have things, and I know, not very pleasant, right? Diarrheal diseases. This doesn't have the Brant line, but by now you can kind of get a sense of where that line is, right? Drinking water or diseases that are basically a function of water, diarrheal diseases, malaria, which basically the risk in the US is none. And by none, I mean zero. Versus low risk and significant risk in this area of the world. So basically equatorial regions of South America, Africa, and Asia. And then of course, HIV/AIDS, and this is an old statistic now, it really needs to be updated, but this is the latest that your book has. by and large, most of HIV/AIDS prevalence is found nowadays in Africa and Russia, actually. So that one sort of goes against the whole Brant Line discussion, because Russia has a significant high STD/HIV/AIDS problem, in addition to other diseases like alcoholism. Here's some other examples. So life expectancy, infant mortality, life expectancy at age 1, all kinds of things. So this is talking about the Human Development Index, HDI. So it takes into account health, education, and living standards, and it comes up with a number, and that number is between 0 and 1. And so basically, again, the Brant Line, the greener you are, the more developed you are. So often it is cited that countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland are the most developed places in the world, meaning they have the best healthcare, the best education, the best gender equality of anywhere. And then, of course, notice that number is less than half. So the value is 0 to 1. 1 would be a perfect society. Notice no such place exists. Less than 0.5 or less than half is really bad. And where are those? Again, Sub-Saharan Africa, Yemen, Afghanistan, and North Korea. Remember those 4 countries we talked about earlier. The role of women and the role of women in different countries. So it varies, you know, in a place like Germany, in a place like the US, even though we haven't had a woman president, a woman has run. Women have been governors, women have been secretaries of state and generals. And so that role of women in our society is very different than, say, a woman in an area where the basic farming, subsistence farming still happens. So here's the role of women as a function of women in the labor force. And again, the Brant Line focus north and south of that. Okay, so now in Africa, there's a significant number of women in the labor force, and this is interesting because in Africa, most women, not most women, that's an incorrect statement. In Africa, the majority of farmers are women, greater than 50%. So the women are involved in the labor force. They're just involved in a different way than they would be, say, in the US or Canada or Europe. Okay, so that's significant. That's a big deal there. So that's the lesson. It's a really interesting one. And again, I just want you to focus on the maps, and I want you to focus on the imagery. And if you have any questions, please let me know. We can set up a Zoom office hour, or we can talk on the phone or by email, whatever works for you. Let me know what happens. If you have any questions, if anything comes up, just, you know, get a hold of me. So otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic week and stay well. Thank you.